Hey everyone, it's Jennette and welcome back to my channel, This Story Ain't Over. Today I'm super excited to talk about the 24 books that I read this summer. So it is September 1st when I'm filming this, and it has been a wild and chaotic summer this summer. My sister got married, I went on a few trips, and overall it was just chaotic with like lots of social plans, and like one of the first summers after the pandemic started that I have been able to be really social and do a lot of things. And so it's been really nice, and I've loved every moment of the summer, but it's also been crazy busy. And despite how busy I was this summer, somehow I ended up reading 24 books. And part of that was due to the fact that I was doing a lot of like experiment videos, reading experiment videos where I read a bunch of books for videos. So that was part of the reason why I was able to read so much this summer, whereas in previous months I usually read a lot less. So I'm quite proud of myself, and I thought it would be fun to wrap up all 24 books that I read this summer. So I haven't done a wrap up since about April, I think. So this will be books I read from May, June, July, and August. There's not much else to say other than that. I'm going to tell you my thoughts on each of these books. It'll be a quick couple of sentences because we have 24 books to get through, but I hope you enjoy, and let me know what you thought of any of these books and what you thought of my thoughts on them as well. Alrighty, we're starting off strong with Know My Name by Chanel Miller, and this one was honestly one of my favorite books of the year. It's really difficult subject matter. It's a memoir by a sexual assault and rape survivor, and that is Chanel Miller, who was previously known as Emily Doe in the Brock Turner case. And this was honestly a really eye-opening read. I personally hadn't really followed the case when it was happening in real life on the news. I had heard about it like in passing, but I hadn't been following it at the time. And so reading the memoir from Chanel's perspective and hearing her side of the story and hearing all the things that she went through was just a really eye-opening experience. And also I think she shed a lot of light on the systemic problems with, you know, the legal system when it comes to sexual assault, and how survivors are forced to like relive their trauma like multiple times over like a ridiculously long amount of time, and even then they're barely given the justice that they deserve. And it was just, yeah, a really harrowing read, but one that I think needed to be told, and I love that she shared her story with the world. So it was like an A++ read, like 5 out of 5 stars, 10 out of 10 stars. One of the books that I continuously think about since reading, and one of my favorites for the year. Next we have Empire of Sand by Tasha Suri. This was definitely a fun adult fantasy. I did like this one a little bit better than the other one of her books that I've read, which was The Jasmine Throne. This one I felt like was just paced a little bit better. I really liked the characters. It didn't wow me in any way, but I did really enjoy it still. And I do plan on picking up the companion novel or the next book in the series sometime soon. But yeah, if you're looking for a South Asian inspired fantasy with some like really fun, mysterious aspects to it, some magic systems as well, and also more of a low stakes fantasy, I would say, then this one is a fun one to pick up. Next we have On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong, and this one was a beautiful read. I picked this book up because of Elias, who has raved about this book many a time, but basically this one is like a bit of a book of poetry and also like narrative, but also a bit of like a memoir, and it's told through these letters that the son writes to his mother, and it's assumed to be like Ocean writing to his mother, and it just deals with like things that he's going through in his relationship with his mother and all of that, and it's just really beautifully told. There's like themes of sexuality and growing up and being Asian in America, and overall I think this was something very different from what I would usually pick up, so I can't really judge it on like how it measures up to something else in the genre, but I think personally for me, what I loved about it was the, you know, poetic writing and the beautiful things that Ocean had to say and the way that he described things, and also just like the very vulnerable look into himself and to his relationship with his mother. It's definitely very much a book that is all vibes, no plot, but it's like slightly part memoir as well. So yeah, it's like a weird book, but I think it's like a beautiful one also. I do think it could be a little bit of a hit or miss depending on what kind of books you like, but I thought it was beautifully written. The next book is probably one of my favorites of the year, which was Blue Skin Gods by S.J. Sindu. I read this for the Reading Color book club, which is my book club if you did not know, and I absolutely loved this one. It had so many twists and turns and blew me away in ways that I did not expect. It is mainly a contemporary story that I had thought would have a fantasy element to it, but it actually didn't, which I really, really loved. And it follows a boy who has blue skin and is assumed to be some sort of god in India. And you follow his life as it takes him in unexpected directions. I just love the main character in that book and just like the journey he goes on. And I honestly just love the book because it dealt with so many interesting themes, and definitely one that I like consistently think about since reading it. Alrighty, this next one is a bit of a weird one, and that is This Is How You Lose the Time War. This one I picked up because I had vaguely heard that it had a sapphic romance and also was a sci-fi, and prior to that I had actually thought it was a literary fiction because it just had that kind of vibe to the cover. But when I learned that it was a sci-fi, I was like, okay, I need to read this now. And it's a very, very short book, but it was honestly so weird, but I loved it in a lot of ways and didn't love it in other ways. It definitely wasn't a favorite for me, but I thought it was really cool. It's basically like the sapphic romance across time involving these two like sort of secret agents, I would say, from these two different like sci-fi entities. And I'm not really explaining this right because the book itself was very confusing to me. It's like told out of time and like non-linearly. And I don't do well with non-linear stories, but I still thought it was really, really interesting and like sort of heartbreaking as well. Like the relationship that happens was so beautiful to watch. And for how short the book was, I think the writing was just done so well, and like the relationship building was done so well as well. Next we have The Roughest Draft by Emily Wibberley and siegemund-broka. And this one was the cutest adult romance that involves like writing and like publishing as a theme. So it basically follows a co-writing duo who have sort of fallen out of favor with each other and are forced to come back together to write one last book together and sort of face all of the things that went on with their relationship and do it this one last time because they both have different reasons for it. And what was interesting about this book is that it is actually written by a co-writing duo who is now married, and I just loved that whole entire concept and like the meta-ness of that situation. But overall, this is just a really cute romance. I thought that the chemistry between the characters was really great and I had a really great time reading it. I thought that the like plot was quite unique and like fun, and overall I just had a really good time reading it. So yeah, if you're looking for a fun romance that involves writing in books, this is a fun one to pick up. Next I read Convenience Store Woman, and this one was an interesting one. I had heard about this one all over Book Talk and also Bookstagram, and I was like, you know what, let me see what's up with this book. It's a very short book. It is translated from Japanese. It follows a 30-something, I think, year-old woman who works at this convenience store in Japan, and it's very much a social commentary book, I would say, and like involves some satire as well. And I found the character of the convenience store woman to be super, super interesting. She's this person who is very content with her place in life and doesn't have further ambitions, and I think that's okay, and sometimes we forget that. And so she embodies this like type of person who is like perfectly okay with their lot in life and doesn't need to be shuffled out of it, I guess, despite all of the pressures from society around her. And also makes commentary on like the different pressures for women in society, like, you know, needing to get married or like have children, or, you know, people looking down on you for not having like certain education, like that kind of thing, which also applies to men and other genders. But it was just like a really interesting sort of social commentary, I would say. It had some like weird and crazy situations to it as well, but overall I enjoyed it, and I think it was like a solid commentary on the way that we operate in society. The next book was Book Lovers by Emily Henry, and this was definitely a fun and favorite romance of the year. This one is a romance between an editor and an agent in publishing, and it was honestly the cutest like small town romance ever. I had high hopes for it and absolutely fell in love with it. I wanted more out of the characters and could honestly read pages and pages more. I absolutely love the way that their relationship progressed and developed, and it like had this element of like bookishness and, you know, the different tropes that we have in books and like rom-coms as well. And there was like a sister relationship in the book as well that I loved. So overall, a really fun romance that I absolutely adored, and I honestly can't decide if I like it more or less than Emily Henry's other books. Next I have Violeta by Isabel Allende, and this one was one that I sort of picked up on a whim because I loved the cover of it, and it is this big long look over 100 years of this one woman's life, from when she's a baby during the Spanish flu until our present day during the pandemic. And it was an interesting sort of situation. I thought that some of the more modern day elements would be a bigger part of the story, but a lot of the time is spent in the past and the main character's various struggles as she was growing up and becoming an adult. And overall, it was an interesting read, and I loved like the historical aspects of it, but I think I didn't love the way it was told in sort of this matter-of-fact, distant way. I wish there was like more emotion and like in-depth looks at certain moments in the character's life. Next we have The Paris Apartment by Lucy Foley, and this one was a fun sort of mystery thriller. I'm not a huge thriller reader, so it takes very little to impress me when it comes to a mystery thriller, and this one was a fun one. It takes place in this like apartment in Paris, and it follows this young woman who goes there looking for her brother, or expecting to stay with her brother, and then he's missing, and so she starts like trying to figure out what's going on and learning things from the neighbors who live in that apartment and finding out some dirty little secrets. And overall, I found it really interesting, and I was like wanting to know what was going to happen next and what the twists were, and I thought that all the twists were really good. So yeah, overall I enjoyed it. It was like a fun thriller, not like life-changing, but a fun one. Next we have Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Sulin Tan, and this one was such a beautiful adult fantasy. Honestly, this one felt more like a YA though, I will say that, and I know a lot of reviews have brought that up, but it was a fun fantasy. It involves like Chinese mythology, and it follows basically the daughter of this moon goddess who has been sort of imprisoned, and the main character sort of sets off to, you know, earn her own place in the world and find a way to help out her mother, and ends up in like these different romances and like these different roles and stuff, and it was a lot of fun. I do think it was very like romance focused, and I wish there was like a little bit more going on in other aspects of the story, but overall it was like a really fun read and a really fun fantasy, and so many cool elements to it to do with the mythology. So overall a beautiful fantasy world, and I would love to read the next book in the series as well. Next, we have one of my most disappointing reads of the year, which was This Woven Kingdom by Tara Mafi. Many of you know that Tara Mafi is one of my favorite authors. I personally love her contemporaries. I've never read her Shadow Me series, which is her dystopian series. And honestly, I think this book in particular, I would have enjoyed more had I still been a teen. Like, I think reading it now in this point in my life, I didn't enjoy it as much, but had I read it when I was a teen, I probably would have loved it. But basically, this book is a fantasy inspired by Persia and like Persian mythology, and I thought it was like a really beautiful world. It had some fun things going on, but ultimately I wanted it to be like more of a grander story than it was, and I felt like I didn't really connect with the romance or the characters, and honestly not much really vibed with me for this book. So yeah, I think my expectations were really high, and I wanted it to be something it was not. So I do blame my expectations on it for most of the reason why I didn't enjoy it. I don't think it's a bad book, but I think it just wasn't the book for me. Next we have Crooked Hallelujah by Kelly Jo Ford. This was another Reading Color book club pick. This is by a Cherokee author, and it's set in Oklahoma, and it follows generations of women from this same family, and it just, you know, talks about the things that they are going through and like the different relationships between these generations of women. And it was honestly just like a really beautiful book, and delves into a lot of things to do with like being Indigenous, which I really loved. So yeah, it was one of the first books that I read by an Indigenous author, so I'm definitely planning to read more. And we had a really lovely discussion for it for the Reading Color book club with Bear from A2 Brody. So if you haven't checked them out yet, go check them out. Next we have one of my favorite books of the year, which was Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng. I did not expect to love this as much as I did. I went into it thinking it was like a literary fiction that I wasn't gonna love, but I was blown away. I loved the writing, I loved the social commentary and the look at these two women and these two families, and also like the racial undertones to it. And I am actually in the middle of watching the show right now and also loving that. So yeah, it was a really, really well written book. And I think if you love sort of social dramas and like not dramatic ones, but sort of subtle drama, it's fantastic. And just the way it was written was so well done, and it had so much commentary on different themes to do like race, motherhood. Also, it's like set in the 90s as well, so there's like that whole element to it, and I just loved it overall. Next we have An American Marriage by Tayari Jones, and this book, my guys, was so freaking good. Another book, another like literary fiction that I didn't think I was gonna like, and I absolutely loved it. Like one of my favorite books of this year. This is a book of very, very messy people getting into a very, very messy situation, and I loved every moment of it. It is about a Black couple in America. They are separated because the husband is accused of a crime that he didn't commit, and so he's sent to jail. And they are sort of separated because of that, and so it puts a strain on their relationship. And the book also follows them like later on when he is released, and how they have to deal with their relationship afterwards. The thing I love about this book has to do with the title itself, which is An American Marriage, because everything about this marriage and this story was very American and had so many ties to being a couple, a Black couple in America. And I thought it was just such an interesting sort of heartfelt and emotional story, but also like had so much social commentary and had so many themes to think about and discuss and talk about, and I just loved every moment of it. So yeah, it's definitely a book that like has stayed with me, and I keep thinking about it to this day, and I just want more people to read it, even though I know it's like a super popular book. I think it was just so amazing and well done. And also I think the characters were so well written. Like they felt so 3D and so multifaceted. Like they have so many flaws to them, which I think made them so real, and none of the characters were necessarily good or bad or guiltless in any way, but I love that about them. Next we have Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine, and this one was not particularly a favorite of mine. It was a literary fiction. I'd heard a lot about it, but yeah, it did not hit the mark for me. It reminded me a lot of Convenience Store Woman, but it had a lot of aspects to it that I didn't like as well, and personally I just didn't vibe with the main character. So I think it was like a interesting book, but not my favorite, so I didn't really think about it too much afterwards. Next, we have another literary fiction that absolutely blew me away, and that was The Vanishing Half by Bennett. This one, similar to An American Marriage, has like very complex and flawed main characters who do messy things and get into messy situations, but the act of following them was just so fascinating and interesting. And this is also a story of like very deeply emotional relationships, but also like lots of social commentary. And this one is set, I think, across like multiple decades, I think in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And it had so much commentary about like that time in America. And it's about these two twins, identical twins, who end up getting separated, and one of them, you know, lives her life passing as white, and then the other one lives their life as a black woman. And it was such an interesting story, and one that has like highs and lows and like beautiful romantic moments, but also really beautiful family moments, and crosses generations as well. It's not just about these two twins, it's like about their children and about the people who came before them. And it was just a wonderful story overall, and I think it was really, really well written as well. It's another book that will get you thinking so much and like discussing, and there's so many things I could unpack about that book, but it was just fantastic and you need to go read it. Next, we have a book that I never thought I'd actually be picking up because I was so scared it would disappoint me, but it did not, and that book was Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. This book, honestly, I was so scared to pick it up because there was so much hype around it, and I knew objectively that like I would probably like it, but I just knew that like my expectations of it would be so high that like it could easily disappoint me. But this book was so freaking good, guys. I loved every moment of it. It was just honestly the most beautiful, fun, and loving like gay romance that you could ever read, and I just loved it. I loved it so much. I think it was so great as both like a romance, but also like a social commentary on like a lot of the things that are going on in the book. And I think it's like this really idealistic and beautiful look and like alternate reality of what our world could be. And I think a lot of people took issue with the fact that it was too happy, but I think it is also like something we need, you know, we need to sometimes think about what if the world were this awesome. And I just loved every moment of it. It did give me like deep anxiety reading the book because I was like, okay, now something has to go wrong. But I loved it, and yeah, I just have these characters like very close in my heart. Like I just want them to be happy and nothing to go wrong. The next book that I picked up was very dark in comparison, and that was I'm Glad My Mother Died by Jennette McCurdy. And this is a memoir by Jennette McCurdy, which just came out recently, and everyone has been buzzing about it, and honestly, it's well deserved because it was such a well-written memoir. It is basically by Jennette McCurdy, who, if you don't know, was the person who played Sam in iCarly on Nickelodeon, and also Sam and Cat with Ariana Grande. And she is a wonderful human who has gone through some very difficult and dark things. And she talks a lot about her life as a child star and like the pressures that were put on her, especially by her mother, and the very complicated relationship that she had with her mother, and the way that she both idolized her and also loved her, but also was like abused both sexually, verbally, and how that affected her like self-image and like her view of herself, and how that bled into her other relationships and the way that she's leading her life, and how she was forced into this career that she never really wanted from the beginning, and how it affected her mental health. And there's so many aspects to this book and like her life that we get to learn that I found so fascinating. And I'm so glad she told her story because I think it was just really eye-opening in a way, and like fascinating to read about as well. There are some very dark and triggering things in here. It's also got triggers for eating disorders, so I'd be careful of that when you're picking it up. And overall, it's just such a well-written memoir, and I think, yeah, she just did a really great job of telling her story. The next book I picked up was Luster by Raven Leilani. This one was one that I didn't expect to like as much as I did. I thought it was going to be more of a mediocre read for me, but it was freaking fantastic. It wasn't a 5-star, but it was definitely like a solid 4. Really interesting story and like sort of sad, hot girl, unhinged woman book, but it follows this young woman who ends up in this like weird open relationship with this man who's already married and has a child, a adopted child who is black, and the main character is black, and the guy she's dating is white, and so is his wife. And so it's this interesting situation, slightly kind of like Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney, and like all of the disillusionment to the character, but also has this like added element of like the daughter and that relationship and like the racial implications of everything that's going on. And I honestly found it a fascinating book. Like, I enjoyed my time reading it, and I was just really invested in the main character's story and what was happening with her. And she was like definitely not a character who was making good decisions, but like I wanted the best for her. The next book is one that's honestly a contender for a favorite book of the year, and that is Disorientation by Elaine Say Shao. This book was so cool. It was a book about like academia and sort of being Asian in academia and being a person of color in academia, but it was also like a, you know, sad hot girl, unhinged woman type of book, and had this like disillusionment with the world and that sort of vibe to it, but it delves into so many different things. Like, it was also a bit of a mystery thriller while also being like a literary fiction, and it had so many things going for it and had so many themes it discussed, and it was also told in this very sort of satirical style and like writing, which I really, really loved. It was something I didn't expect from the book, but the way it was executed was just so well done, and honestly just like a really interesting book if you're planning to pick it up, because yeah, it just tackled so many things both in academia and just like our wider world, and talks a lot about like race and privilege and the types of knowledge that we value, and I just loved it so freaking much. The next book was You Exist Too Much by Zaina Arafat, and this is by a Palestinian American author, and this was honestly such a great book. It wasn't my favorite, but I did really enjoy the experience of reading it. It was a book that was told in a non-linear format, so I struggled a little bit with that and sort of the endless parade of people that the main character sleeps with, but I think getting to see the psyche of this character was so fascinating. She has a very complicated relationship with her mother, which affects everything in her life, and she's just going through it, and I found it so interesting to follow her as a character. And it's this story of like a character who just feels too much, like she exists too much, as her mother says in the book, and I thought it was just really interesting. There's also like a lot of elements of the character talking about, you know, her Palestinian heritage and how that affects the way that she interacts with people in her world. Alrighty, the second last book that I read this summer was Rosewater by Tahereh Thompson, and this was another Reading Color Book Club pick, and I am really glad that we actually picked this one up because it was very different from anything I've read before. It is a sci-fi fantasy novel. It is set in Nigeria, which is a setting I've never read from, and it was this really cool situation like set far into our future in Nigeria, where there's been some like alien contact, and there's this like dome in this city called Rosewater that has like these healing properties, and there's this whole element of like psychic characters, if you will, and a mystery to do with like the government, and a bit of a thriller and action movie aspect to this. And honestly, this was like a very genre bending book, but it was a really interesting book as well. Like, I wanted to know what was going to happen by the end, and I was very confused by a lot of parts of the book, but I think that was like a general sentiment for most of the people who have read this. And another element to this book is that it's told in a bit of a non-linear format as well, so part of the reason why I struggled with it, but also part of the reason that makes it really interesting and fascinating as well. And there's just so many reveals to this book that I'm excited to see further explored in the next one. But if you're into big sci-fi and sort of first contact and like psychics and like different sort of magical or sci-fi abilities, if you are into mystery, this one's definitely one to pick up. Alrighty, and then the final book that I read this summer, the 24th book, was The School for Good Mothers by Jessamine Chan. This one was such an interesting sort of social commentary, alternate reality book. It is set in our real world, but it involves a situation where the government is cracking down on like bad mothers and bad parents. And so anytime they're reported, they are sent to this school for mothers and fathers or whatever, and, you know, taught to be whatever, better parents, I guess, and they have to pass in order to like regain custody of their children and get to see them again and stuff. So it follows this one woman who makes this one mistake at the beginning of the book where she leaves her child at home for a period of time alone, and she's reported, and then the whole situation sort of comes to light, and she is trying to defend herself to the legal system and also like the social workers, and ends up having to go to the school. And it's so interesting the way that this was written, and it's definitely a bit of a like satirical portrayal of this situation, and I thought it was so fascinating. I think it makes a lot of commentary on the expectations that we have of women and of mothers, and the way that mothers are both put on a pedestal but also expected to be perfect in all ways, and how we sometimes stop thinking of them as like people on their own and more as like only a mother. Another thing that was interesting about this book is that there's like so many other mothers in this book, and a lot of them are like terrible people also, but you're just like seeing the different sort of situations that have molded them into these people and, you know, making these mistakes with their children. And it's just so interesting to read about. I think none of the characters are wholly right or good, but not wholly bad or awful. And it just like walks this fine line of like, what does it mean to be a good mother? And what are we using to define that phrase? And I just found it really, really interesting. I think I have no answers when it comes to this book, but I just found it so fascinating. And with that, we have speed talked our way through 24 books that I read this summer. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and that you got to learn more about the stuff that I read this summer. I had so much fun with a lot of these books, and some of them were misses, but I think overall I had a pretty good reading summer, and I'm excited for all the books that I'm going to pick up this fall. A lot of these books I did talk about in other videos, so I'd love it if you guys would go check them out in those other videos. I have a Hot Sad Girl books video. I have a video reading Goodreads most reviewed books. I have a video reading Goodreads most popular books. So there's a ton of videos up from this summer that I would love for you guys to go check out. Thank you guys so much for watching as usual. Definitely leave me a comment down below on what your favorite book of the summer was, and I will see you in my next video. So please remember that the story ain't over. Bye!